perhaps for Japan, which is an island, but not for other countries. So it perhaps distorts the idea of culture and forces it into just being countries. And also, I think, I don't want to exaggerate this, but it seems to me there is a feeling of what is often called othering about this. That activities like this emphasize the differences between countries. And they point out how one person's food is radically different from another person's food. And so, say, from a European perspective, a European student might find Japanese breakfast very strange, or a Thai student might find German breakfast very strange. And it tends to give this feeling of cultures being different, being other from each other, rather than perhaps emphasizing similarities and connections between them. I'd like to say more about othering a bit later on in the talk. Okay, I made this recording about German breakfast, which you just heard. I thought it would be interesting to just record the same person, the same speaker, and ask her what in fact she really has for breakfast, rather than just talking about this picture. This is what she said.
My family has different things for breakfast. On working days, my son likes to have something quick and like toasties with cheese and ham. My husband has mostly a quick yogurt with muesli and fruit. And I sometimes, when I have time, make myself warm breakfast with like porridge with fruit and nuts. But on the weekend, we really indulge in a long breakfast and sit together at the table and have bread and butter and different kinds of salami and ham and cheese and mozzarella and jam and boiled egg. So we have a kind of huge, big kind of brunch that we all have together and enjoy each other's company as well.
Okay, as you hear this, I think this gives a feeling of cultural behaviour. Breakfast is, of course, cultural behaviour, which is infinitely more flexible and varied and also more individual than just a statement about what people in different countries do. This woman is obviously a representative of her culture, but she is also an individual within that culture, and what she says reflects that. And this suggests perhaps there might be more interesting ways of approaching areas such as this, extending out from just breakfast now to talking about meal times, which are a very important cultural event. These are some of the questions which seem to me perhaps go a little bit below the surface and tap into much more interesting areas. And as I do, I'll just read these through very quickly, and perhaps as I read them you might just reflect on what answers would you give to these, and what does this tell you about your own habits and your relationship with your own culture. So what time do you usually have breakfast? Do you usually have meals? Sorry, are meals quick, or do they take a long time? Do you say anything before you begin a meal, like a blessing, for example, or at the end? What is the main meal of the day, and why is it important? Do you eat at the same time as other people? And do you eat in the same room? And do you usually talk while you're eating? If so, what do you usually talk about? And who usually prepares the meal? Or does everyone help? Still quite simple questions, and questions I think we can ask students, but I think which start to go into much more interesting areas. They go below the surface, and in fact move a long way now from where we were with what the Japanese have for breakfast and what the Germans have for breakfast. So we're beginning with topics like this seem to involve a much richer content and seem to deal with not just facts but with cultural behaviour, and also recognise the fact of individual variation within cultures, and your culture not just being your country but maybe your family group, your neighbourhood, your region and so on. Extending out perhaps then towards a country, and taking as a starting point your own personal life and experience. It seems to me that culture is primarily your personal culture, and it's a relationship, an interaction between yourself and various groups of people. I've tried to represent here this view of culture, which we might want our students to use with our students. So a contrast between, on the left, this idea of our culture versus other people's cultures, bound and different, us versus them. And on the right, perhaps what culture really means to people, which starts with the self, and it's a relationship between family maybe, friends, your peer group, possibly your country or region, your speech community, which may be very important in determining culture, and then beyond that to other cultures where there might be similarities or differences. Okay, I'd like to move now. So I've been approaching kind of the idea of topic and what might be culturally rich topics. I'd like to move now to look more closely at this area of culture shock and cultural differences and misunderstandings. It's quite interesting if you key into Amazon a word like intercultural or cross-cultural, what you get is a lot of books, a lot of academic books on the subject, which is what you'd expect, of course, but you also get a lot of bestsellers on the subject, and these are books, mostly British and American, written for tourists and for businessmen, and they tend to focus on this idea of culture shock or difficulty in operating in other cultures. Here is a selection of them. I apologise for the slightly bad quality of this. And they have very similar kinds of titles. So you've got Riding the Waves of Culture, Do's and Taboos, Kiss, Bow or Shake Hands, obviously for European visitors to Asia, Mind Your Manners, Culture Shock. This is a whole series of travel guides. This one is about Switzerland, but they're for every country in the world. When Cultures Collide, Multicultural Manners, and Breaking Through Culture Shock. These books all seem to have a common theme, which is that approaching other cultures is going to be very tricky and difficult, and you're likely to make lots of mistakes, and how can you overcome these mistakes? So they focus very much on do's and don'ts, and overcoming, if you like, cultural faux pas when you are operating in another culture. Exactly the same kind of area of what you might call do's and don'ts is very commonly used in EFL materials, which often draw material directly from books of this kind. And very often this is what you see as intercultural content in books. Here's an example about Thailand. This is a slight adaptation this is an actual activity in a European course book, which I've changed slightly, simplified. And you can see how this works. It's a typical intermediate activity, probably, for intermediate. So these are tips for visitors to Thailand, and learners have to decide whether they think they're true or false. So when addressing a Thai person, it's polite to use their last name. You would know much better than I how accurate these are or not. According to the source I got this from, this is not true. And when you meet an older person, it's important to shake hands and bow. This is partially true, according to the source. You bow but not shake hands. The head is important in Thai culture. It's disrespectful to touch another person's head. It's especially true. And the feet are the lowliest part of the body. Also true. And you take your shoes off when you visit someone's home. Also true. So the way this activity works then is learners decide whether they think it's true or false, and then they find out the answer. Again, like the breakfast activity, I think as a language activity, this is absolutely fine. As a fluency activity, it's probably very interesting to do. It generates discussion, and so on. But if we look at it as a way of developing intercultural awareness, again, we can ask this same question: what does it? To what extent does this achieve this? And I think a useful way to look at this, perhaps, is to look not at what the exercise apparently does, but if you like, at the subtext, at the underlying message of this activity. What words, if this was all you ever knew about Thailand, what words or phrases spring to mind? about Thai culture. And I think there are probably words like exotic, strange, alien, incomprehensible. Gives the impression perhaps you have to be extremely careful what you do if you go to Thailand, especially careful what you do with your hands, that people are possibly very easily offended. This seems to be the kind of underlying message of this activity, which, I mean, from my own impression of being in Thailand, is a very long way from being an accurate portrayal of what Thai culture is like. So this is perhaps, again, a stereotyped, rather distorted view of the culture. I'm sorry, and I mentioned earlier the idea of othering, and it seems to me this is a good example, well, a bad example, a very strong example of othering. That, in a sense, for a European learner using this activity, this kind of others Thailand. It makes it seem very different from their own culture. Also interesting, and I think this is very typical of EFL materials, this is, of course, Thailand seen from a European perspective. And very often, I think, because books tend to be written by Europeans or Americans, the world is interpreted very much through European eyes, and so unintentionally, they are often very culture-bound in this way. Just by contrast, I'd like to play you a recording which I made myself some years ago. This is a recording of a friend of mine who's travelled in Sudan. And he went on a long train journey in Sudan. This was a time when it was much easier to travel in Sudan than sadly it is now. And he describes an experience of culture shock, if you like, on this train, which I'd like to clip.
I was travelling in the Sudan by train, and the journey I had to make was going to last about 48 hours. And about an hour into the journey, someone in my compartment, I think there were another 7 people in the compartment, someone spread a large cloth on the floor, and people began to bring out food. No one had a knife, so people were breaking up the food and placing it on the cloth. I realized this was the thing to do, so all I had was 3 or 4 tomatoes. So I broke up my tomatoes and put them on the cloth. And then we all started to eat the food, and there was bread and beans and lamb and many different things, and people were eating, and I noticed that no one was eating my tomatoes. So I encouraged them to eat, and everyone smiled very politely, but wouldn't actually take any. And slowly the food disappeared, and my tomatoes were left. So at the end of the meal, there was nothing left except my tomatoes. And I felt slightly uneasy about this. I didn't know why. I thought probably it was because I was a foreigner, and perhaps the Sudanese people didn't want to take foreigners' food from them. So in fact, I ate the tomatoes myself. It was only sometime later that I realized that in fact the reason that people hadn't eaten my tomatoes was because I had broken up the tomatoes with both hands.
Okay. Yeah, the point of the story, of course, is that he broke a Middle Eastern cultural taboo, if you like many cultures who eat food with their hands. You only use your right hand to touch food and not your left hand. So this is again, okay, it's a culture seen from the outside, and it's an experience of culture shock. But I think it is very different in thinking about its underlying message, its subtext. It's very different from this activity about Thailand we just looked at. Again, if I ask, well, if this is all you know about Sudan from this person's account, what is the impression he gives of the culture? What words spring to mind to describe Sudanese culture from this account? And I think there are words like, well, hospitable, probably, inclusive, supportive, polite, sharing, respectful of foreigners, welcoming, perhaps. Mostly very positive. It's a very positive image that he creates through this context. And it seems to me this is extremely important. One might regard him as perhaps a witness to the culture. So given that most of us here know very little about Sudan and Sudanese culture, and in a language classroom, your learners will generally know very little about other cultures. It's extremely important, you really rely on kind of witnesses, on people telling you about the culture, and it's extremely important that these accounts are not stereotyped, not prejudiced, are positive, or at least neutral, and don't make judgments about the culture. And I think another thing about this is that what comes across from this is that he is baffled, he is in a state of culture shock, if you like, but he is making a genuine effort to try to get underneath the surface of Sudanese culture, to try to figure out what it is exactly that he's not quite doing right. I'm sure many of us have this experience as well in other cultures. So he's not simply being dismissive and saying, so, well, I don't know what's going on here. He's really trying to see what the culture is about and learn from it. Again, a very positive form of model, if you like, or of witness, which would be important to use, I think, in approaching a topic like this in a classroom. Okay, I'd like to come back to this in a minute. For a moment, I would like to depart at this point from English language teaching and look at other areas. As we all know, the whole issue of developing intercultural awareness is relatively new to English language teaching, but of course it's not at all new as a topic in its own right. And there are many areas, many fields of study, for example, social anthropology and cultural studies and social studies, where these issues have been discussed for a very long time, probably 100 years or more. You may be familiar, for example, with the American social anthropologist Boas, who I think in the 1920s, I don't know the exact date, coined the expression cultural relativism to describe the idea, or to portray the idea that cultures are not superior to each other or more developed than each other, they're simply different from each other.